There's a particular kind of anxiety that arrives quietly, not with protests in the streets, not with dramatic headlines, but through small conversations in supermarkets, through worried calls between parents and children, through older people sitting at kitchen tables staring at letters from banks they've trusted for decades and suddenly feeling as though the language has changed. And I think that's what's beginning to happen across parts of the United Kingdom right now. Because behind the discussions about fraud prevention, digital banking, identity verification, branch closures, and financial security, there's another conversation emerging underneath all of it, a quieter one, a more emotional one, and honestly, it says something much larger about the relationship between modern Britain and the people who grew up believing its institutions were built around them. Over the last few years, banks across the UK have accelerated changes to the way customers access money, more security checks, more fraud detection systems, more digital verification, more account monitoring, more branch closures, more online-only services, and on paper, most of it makes complete sense. Fraud has become a genuine national problem. Criminal scams targeting pensioners are increasingly sophisticated. Fake text messages, phone scams, online impersonation, criminal gangs convincing elderly people to transfer life savings within minutes. Banks would argue with some justification that tighter controls are necessary, and maybe they are, but what's interesting is how many retirees are beginning to experience those protections not as reassurance, but as barriers. That distinction matters. Because when a retired person suddenly struggles to access their own account, when a payment gets flagged as suspicious, when they're told to download an app they don't understand, when the local branch they relied on disappears entirely, the emotional experience is very different from the language used in official banking statements. To institutions, these are efficiency measures. To many older people, they feel like warning signs, and you can almost feel a broader unease building underneath it all. Not simply about money, but about relevance, about whether modern Britain still feels recognizable to the people who spent decades working, saving, and trusting the systems around them. I keep coming back to something you hear older voters say increasingly often now: I don't recognize the country anymore. Now that phrase can sound dramatic. Sometimes it's dismissed as nostalgia. Sometimes younger generations hear it as resistance to progress. But I think there's usually something more human happening underneath those words, because many retirees aren't necessarily rejecting technology itself. What they're struggling with is the pace of adaptation, the sense that every year another familiar structure disappears, another branch closes, another phone number becomes automated, another face-to-face conversation gets replaced with passwords, verification codes, and chatbots. And eventually, for some people, daily life starts to feel less like participation and more like navigation. That's a very different emotional experience, especially later in life, especially for people who grew up in a Britain where banking was deeply personal. There was a time, and not even that long ago, when many customers knew the staff at their local branch by name. A bank manager was someone visible in the community. Problems were solved through conversations rather than digital forms. Trust felt human. Now, of course, that older system had limitations too. It was slower, less efficient, less secure in many ways, but the emotional architecture was different. People felt seen, and honestly, that feeling matters more than policymakers sometimes realize. Because money is never just financial, it's psychological. It represents independence, competence, stability, control, and perhaps nowhere is that more true than among retirees. For many pensioners, the ability to manage their own finances represents dignity itself. The idea that after decades of work, mortgages, raising families, and paying taxes, they can still operate independently within society. So when banking systems suddenly become confusing or inaccessible, the emotional impact reaches far beyond inconvenience. It can feel humiliating. That's the word that appears quietly in interviews and community discussions now: humiliation. Older people describing themselves feeling embarrassed asking younger relatives for help logging into accounts, ashamed when they can't understand digital instructions, nervous about making mistakes online, frightened of scams, worried that one wrong click could wipe out savings built over a lifetime. And the thing people are starting to notice is that this fear exists alongside another contradiction. Retirees are simultaneously viewed as vulnerable people needing protection, while also being expected to navigate increasingly complex systems with very little human support. That tension sits at the center of this entire debate, because banks are not wrong when they warn about fraud, but retirees are not wrong either when they say modern banking sometimes feels designed for somebody else, and maybe that's the point. Perhaps what we're watching isn't simply a technological transition. Perhaps it's a cultural one, a shift in how institutions relate to ordinary citizens, Over the past 2 decades, Britain has steadily reorganized itself around speed and efficiency. Online services, automated systems, centralized customer support, reduced staffing, remote communication. Again, none of this happened overnight, and individually, each decision often appeared reasonable: closing one underused branch, introducing one additional security step, encouraging customers to use digital platforms, reducing in-person services to cut costs. Each change sounds manageable in isolation, but when you combine them together over time, the cumulative effect can feel enormous, especially for older people who experience these transitions all at once. And what's fascinating politically is that retirees notice institutional change very quickly, partly because they rely on these systems more regularly, but also because they remember previous versions clearly. Younger generations often adapt to change gradually because digital systems arrived alongside adulthood itself. Online banking feels normal if you grew up with smartphones, but imagine spending 60 or 70 years understanding the world one way, only to find that almost every major institution suddenly requires technological fluency: healthcare, government services, travel, utilities, banking. Even simple tasks now involve passwords, updates, verification links, and online forms. And I think younger people sometimes underestimate how exhausting constant adaptation becomes later in life. When you're 25, learning a new system feels temporary. When you're 75, it can feel relentless. That emotional fatigue matters, because once people begin feeling overwhelmed by systems they cannot fully control, trust starts to erode, slowly, quietly, not through dramatic rebellion, but through withdrawal. And you can already sense the political implications beginning to form around this issue. Retirees remain one of the most politically engaged demographics in Britain. They vote consistently, they influence elections heavily. Governments pay attention to how older voters feel, which means concerns around banking access are unlikely to remain purely financial discussions. They become conversations about citizenship, about inclusion, about whether modern Britain still accommodates people who are not digitally confident. Already there are debates around the disappearance of cash infrastructure across the country, rural communities losing local branches, elderly residents traveling miles to access basic services, questions about whether the UK is moving too quickly toward a cashless society without fully considering who gets left behind. And what's interesting is that these concerns now stretch beyond traditionally conservative voters, because there's a wider public anxiety emerging around automation itself. You see it in hospitals, in customer service, in transport, in supermarkets. People increasingly feel they are interacting with systems rather than human beings, sometimes efficiently, sometimes not, but impersonally either way. And banking perhaps intensifies this feeling more than almost any other sector, because financial access affects survival itself. If a streaming service fails, it's annoying. If your bank account becomes inaccessible, even temporarily, it can feel existential, especially for retirees living on fixed incomes, especially during a cost of living crisis, especially when energy bills, food prices, and housing pressures already dominate everyday anxiety. There's this growing feeling that many older people are carrying multiple layers of insecurity simultaneously: economic insecurity, technological insecurity, social insecurity, and beneath all of it, a quieter emotional insecurity. The fear of becoming dependent. That fear is incredibly powerful, because independence is central to how many people understand adulthood itself. To suddenly feel unable to manage basic financial tasks can create a profound sense of vulnerability. And honestly, that emotional reality often gets lost inside policy discussions. Politicians talk about digital transformation, banks talk about fraud prevention, economists talk about efficiency, but ordinary people often talk about something much simpler: feeling shut out, feeling confused, feeling left behind. And the conversation seems to be shifting toward a larger national question now: how do modern societies evolve without quietly abandoning the people least equipped to adapt quickly? Because Britain is hardly alone in this. Across much of Europe and the wider Western world, aging populations are colliding with rapid technological acceleration. Governments and corporations are designing systems for the future, while millions of citizens still operate emotionally and practically within structures built decades earlier. That gap creates friction, not always visible friction, but emotional friction, cultural friction, generational friction. And maybe that's why this issue resonates so deeply, because at its core it isn't really about banking restrictions. It's about what happens when modernization begins to feel impersonal, when progress stops feeling collective and starts feeling selective. There's also another uncomfortable layer to all this. Many retirees spent their entire working lives being told that responsibility would guarantee security: work hard, save carefully, trust institutions, plan for retirement, and in return, stability would follow. That was the social contract many people believed in, but now some older citizens look around and feel as though the rules are shifting late in the process. The branch disappears, the account procedures change, the pension system feels uncertain, the technology moves faster than expected, and suddenly retirement no longer feels like arrival. It feels like adaptation all over again. That's psychologically exhausting. And honestly, there's something slightly haunting about watching generations who spent decades building modern Britain now feeling increasingly alien inside it. Not because anybody explicitly pushed them out, but because systems evolved in ways that no longer instinctively include them. Now, to be fair, there are also strong arguments. From the other side, banks cannot realistically ignore digital transformation. Fraud prevention genuinely matters. Physical branches are expensive to maintain. Younger customers overwhelmingly use online services. Financial institutions are under immense pressure to modernize, all true, and perhaps some degree of disruption is unavoidable during periods of technological change. But I think what people are really debating now is not whether modernization should happen, it's how it happens, whether efficiency should completely replace human contact, whether safety measures can coexist with accessibility, whether vulnerable customers should bear the emotional burden of systems designed to protect them. And honestly, Britain may only be at the beginning of this conversation. Because artificial intelligence, automation, and digital infrastructure are going to reshape daily life even further over the next decade. The retirees struggling with banking systems today may simply represent the first visible warning sign of a much broader societal adjustment, a future where large numbers of people feel technologically displaced long before they are economically displaced. And perhaps that explains why this issue feels emotionally bigger than the headlines themselves. People sense that something fundamental is shifting, not just in banking, but in the relationship between citizens and institutions, between human beings and systems, between trust and efficiency. And I think many retirees fear that once human contact disappears from essential services, it rarely returns. That's the deeper anxiety underneath all this, the fear that the world is becoming harder to participate in unless you move at the speed of technology, and not everybody can, not everybody wants to. The question Britain may eventually have to answer is whether modernization automatically means reducing human accessibility, or whether societies can still build systems that feel technologically advanced while remaining emotionally humane. Because the danger isn't simply financial exclusion, it's emotional exclusion, the quiet feeling among millions of older people that the country they spent their lives contributing to is slowly reorganizing itself without them. And maybe that's why these conversations around banking restrictions feel heavier than they first appear. Because beneath the fraud alerts and branch closures and digital passwords lies something much more human. A generation trying to understand whether there is still a place for them inside the future Britain is building, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure the country has answered that question yet.